She whispered not my name. It was late, well past midnight, and I was awake, lying on my side of the bed, back turned to her. At first, I thought I'd misheard. But that murmur came again, soft and unmistakable. A single name, one that wasn't mine. My heart clenched. I stared into the darkness, feeling sweat bead at my temples. She was asleep or half asleep, breathing unevenly, caught in whatever dream had stolen her voice. Except she wasn't dreaming of me. I lay there for a long time, too long, my body rigid and my mind spinning. I remember swallowing hard, my throat dry, thinking, am I losing my mind? Or was that real? Maybe I'd been drifting in that space between dreams myself, conjuring illusions. But a part of me already knew the truth. Something had shifted, or maybe it had been shifting for months. I just refused to see it. When the alarm finally rang in the gray hush of dawn, she stirred beside me as she always did, brushing a stray lock of hair from her eyes. I caught a glimpse of her face in the half-light. She looked peaceful, oddly delicate, as if nothing was wrong. She rose, wrapped herself in the robe I gave her on her last birthday, and disappeared into the bathroom. Water ran behind the closed door, muffled sounds of her morning routine. I lay there, replaying the night's moment in my head, my breath locked in my chest. She whispered not my name. And there was no undoing that. I got up, numb, and put on my usual office attire. Plain white shirt, subdued tie, dark slacks. In the reflection, my eyes looked like they belonged to someone else. I'd never felt older. Never felt so uncertain. My hairline creeping up, lines etching themselves around my mouth. A faint bitterness churned in my gut. I thought about that single word she'd murmured. Robert. And from that moment I couldn't see my wife the same way. She came out, hair carefully toweled, asking if I wanted coffee. Her voice was soft. I mumbled something about having to leave early for work. She gave me a nod, eyes flicking to my face as if searching for something. Then she looked away, and the silence between us weighed heavier than any conversation. I left without breakfast, the taste of unspoken accusations bitter on my tongue. I should have confronted her then. Should have asked, "Who is Robert?" Instead, I drove to the office through damp Seattle streets, the sky a blank wall of clouds. The wipers worked rhythmically, but I couldn't focus on the road. My thoughts circled back, again and again, to the sound of her voice from the night before. A single thread of noise that unraveled everything I believed about my marriage. I knew a man named Robert Jenkins. She'd mentioned him once or twice in casual conversation. An architect, someone she'd worked with on a PR project. She said he had bright ideas and was impossible to dislike, but that's all I'd known. She never volunteered details, and I never asked. Maybe I was too naive or too trusting, or simply too wrapped up in my own routine to realize that lines had blurred. At work, I couldn't concentrate. Numbers and insurance claims stacked on my desk in neat piles. I stared at them, pretended to read, but my mind drifted to dark corners. I pictured them, Anne, and Robert. I felt a sick churn in my gut, imagining her smiling at him the way she used to smile at me. I asked myself 1,000 times, when did we start dying as a couple? When did she first look at another man with the kind of warmth that should have been reserved for me? No answers came. By lunchtime, I was exhausted from simply holding myself together. So I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. It had started to drizzle, a cold, thin rain. I walked aimlessly, my hands shoved deep in my pockets, chin tucked down. I found a coffee place, went in, drank something hot that tasted like cardboard. Across from me, an old man rummaged in his coat for spare change, and I realized how quiet the world felt. Strangely distant, like I was floating behind a sheet of glass. I kept hearing her voice whisper, not my name, in the hush of the morning hours. That night, I came home later than usual. The living room lamp was on. She was sitting on the couch, her legs curled beneath her, reading a magazine about interior design. As soon as I walked in, I saw the tension in her shoulders, in the way she placed the magazine aside as though bracing for something. But again, I didn't ask. Like a coward, I settled into a stiff conversation about dinner and the neighbors. She said she'd made soup, but it was cold now, so she'd warm it up if I wanted. I nodded, my mouth full of silence. We had dinner with meaningless small talk. The soup tasted of thyme and regret. Every so often, I caught her gazing at me, eyes flicking away the second I looked back. We parted ways for the evening. She said she had a project. I claimed a backlog of work. We didn't even kiss goodnight. The ache in my chest felt like a physical bruise, tender to the touch. For days, maybe weeks, I told myself I just needed proof. You can't accuse your wife of betrayal based on a single whispered name in the dark. Maybe it was all in my head, but an instinct hammered inside me. She's cheating. She's gone from you. And I could not let that rest. I'm not proud of what I did next. I asked around discreetly, casual conversations with some of her coworkers, paying closer attention to her phone. I tried to act normal. The man she'd mentioned, Robert Jenkins, was indeed around. He was doing some design work for her PR firm, and apparently they'd been meeting outside the office to discuss details. My stomach churned every time I heard that name, but I needed more. Something undeniable. So I checked her phone one evening while she was in the shower. I told myself it was just for peace of mind. My hands trembled when I saw the message thread with him. It was direct, explicit enough to confirm everything. Phrases of desire, innuendo, half-coded references to their encounters. I felt an immediate rush of nausea. There was no more doubt. I scrolled up, ignoring the burning in my eyes. Words of longing, of promises. I read lines like, "Last night was unforgettable," and my entire body seized with trembling rage. Because last night, she'd come home to me and told me she was exhausted from a late meeting. She was lying so smoothly, like breathing. I put her phone back where I found it, heart pounding. I couldn't confront her yet. Not like that. I stepped out of the bathroom as she turned off the shower. She opened the door, pink steam drifting around her shoulders. She looked at me in confusion. "You okay?" she asked, voice gentle. I realized I was breathing hard, fists clenched. I forced a smile that felt like a mask of clay. "Yeah," I lied. "Just tired." She stared at me for a second, something flickering in her eyes, some faint worry or guilt. Then she reached for her towel. "I'll be done in a minute," she said, stepping around me. I left the bedroom and went into the living room, my mind a swirl of black. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, feeling my heart pound, hearing her soft breathing next to me. My wife. A stranger. That was the exposition of my downfall. A single name I wasn't supposed to hear, a single thread I pulled until the entire tapestry of my marriage started to unravel. Soon, I discovered more. Subtle changes. She bought new lingerie, had it delivered discreetly. I found the receipt in her purse. She started wearing perfume that smelled heavier, a little more daring, definitely not for me. And her phone glowed at odd hours. I'd glance over sometimes and see a single letter on the screen. R. She locked the phone in a hurry, but I caught the flush on her cheeks. I felt disgust, sorrow, an agony that radiated from my chest down to my fingertips. One evening, the tension finally snapped. We'd barely spoken all day. She was in the kitchen, tapping away on her phone, wearing a silk blouse and a skirt she seldom wore at home. I said her name, Anne, quietly at first. She didn't turn around. She was too absorbed in texting. I said it louder, "Anne." She jumped. "What?" She tried to sound casual, but her voice trembled. "You expecting somebody?" I eyed her outfit, her careful makeup. She shrugged, pulling a strand of hair behind her ear. "No." "Why?" "You're dressed like you're about to go out." She stared at me, defiance flickering across her face. "Is it a crime to look decent in my own house?" I laughed, a bitter edge in my voice. "Decent, right." Something about the way she glared at me, like I was intruding on her space, triggered a wave of anger I'd been trying to suppress. "So is this for Robert?" She froze. Her lips parted, but no sound came out at first. Then a quick flash of fear or guilt, or both, rose in her eyes. "What are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about." My voice was ragged. My heart thudded against my ribs. "Should I say his name again?" "Robert Jenkins. You've been meeting him. I've seen the messages." "Messages?" she echoed, her voice pitching higher. "You looked at my phone." I let out a short, grim laugh. "So that's your first concern. My invasion of privacy, not your affair." She gripped the counter behind her, knuckles whitening. "It's not like that. We're working on a project." "Don't lie," I hissed, stepping closer. "You talk about nights in hotel rooms. You talk about how his hands feel on your skin. Don't you dare stand there and insult my intelligence." Her breath caught in her throat. "It just happened," she finally said, voice taut, almost trembling. "I didn't mean." I slammed my fist onto the table, and the sound reverberated through the kitchen. "What about me? About us? Do you have any idea what it feels like, knowing my wife?" I paused, rage flaring. "Knowing that she's giving herself to another man while I'm here, playing the clueless husband." She opened her mouth, tears brimming in her eyes. But they didn't fall. She tried to speak, but only a choked sound emerged. "Michael, I whipped around, unable to stand the sight of her. My voice came out in a snarl. "Save it." For a long moment, neither of us moved. The clock on the wall ticked. My breathing was ragged, and she was shaking, tears threatening to escape, but her jaw set in a stubborn line. Finally, I walked away, shoulders trembling with fury and heartbreak. She called after me, my name, not his, but it was too late. That single name, once whispered in the night, had carved a rift between us I couldn't bridge. We avoided each other for days. And in that silent household, my mind filled with images of them together. I pictured how she laughed for him, how she might whisper his name with longing. The kind of longing she never showed me anymore. My self-esteem shattered, replaced by a raw bitterness that seeped into everything I touched. Time passed like a slow torture. We'd cross paths in the hallway, eyes averted, pulses pounding. Once, I came home early from work, half hoping to catch them together, half terrified of what I'd do if I did. But the house was empty, eerily quiet. I stood in the living room, saw her reflection in the mirror above the mantel. But it was just me standing there, disheveled and angry, haunted by a betrayal I couldn't handle. Then it happened. Late on a Friday, I drove to her office building, telling myself I was just going to pick her up, try to talk like adults, apologize for how I'd roared at her, demand an explanation. Something. Anything. But when I parked across the street, I saw them in the wide glass windows of the lobby, alone, silhouetted by fluorescent light. He was leaning in, whispering something, and she put her hand on his chest, smiling the way she once smiled at me. My hand shook on the steering wheel. I felt a spasm of jealousy so intense I thought I'd black out. They walked together out of the building and stood by his car, talking quietly. When she tilted her head to him, he bent down. They kissed, full, brazen, without shame. My vision blurred with red. I was so close I could have rolled down my window and shouted at them. But I sat frozen instead, breath caught in my throat, humiliated to the core. She parted from him with a soft laugh. I could see the curve of her lips, the warm affection in her eyes, the flush of her cheeks. She used to look at me that way. He opened the car door for her, and they drove off into the night. I followed. I'm not proud of it, but I did. I tailed them across the city, keeping my headlights low. They ended up at a boutique hotel near the waterfront. They went in, oblivious to me. I parked in a dark corner of the lot, hands clutching the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached. Minutes passed. An hour. The clock on my dash read nearly midnight. I told myself I should leave, that staying here only confirmed my absolute failure as a husband. But I couldn't. Hatred, curiosity, heartbreak. They pinned me in place. Eventually, I got out of the car, my legs stiff. I felt the drizzle on my face. The hotel windows glowed, each rectangle a private stage of secrets. I stared up, feeling like I might vomit from anguish. I couldn't stand it. So I went in. The night clerk gave me a polite nod. "Can I help you, sir?" I forced a quick grin that felt unnatural. "I'm waiting for someone." I lied and slipped past. I knew how to act casual enough not to raise suspicion. But my heart was drumming so loud in my ears, I could barely see straight. I found the elevator, took it to the top floor, praying I wouldn't run into them in some hallway. I paced, ears straining for any sound of them. Doors were closed, the corridor silent except for the hum of the overhead lights. I had no plan, no logic, just raw heartbreak that propelled me forward. I moved slowly, scanning the brass room numbers, not sure what I was looking for. Then, by chance or fate, I heard it. A low laugh, a soft moan. My blood turned to ice. I recognized her voice. It was behind a door cracked open an inch, as if it hadn't latched properly. I crept closer, hardly breathing. Through that sliver, I saw them. A slash of lamplight fell across their bodies. She was in his arms, half undressed. He was behind her, pressing close. The sound of her voice, low, desperate, full of desire, stung my ears like acid. I glimpsed pale skin, limbs entwined, the way she clung to his shoulders. Her lips parted in an expression of pleasure so intimate, it felt like a knife in my heart. I'll never forget that instant. My world collapsed, piece by piece, as I watched my wife give herself to another man without shame or regret. The little gasps, the brushing of skin, the hunger in her eyes. It was a private moment, not meant for me to see, but I saw it, and I couldn't unsee it. My chest tightened with a rage so deep it paralyzed me. They whispered words to each other, ragged, breathless words. She moaned his name again and again, and the sound stabbed my soul. I thought, that's the name she whispered in her sleep. The name that replaced mine. Something in me snapped. I pushed the door open, my body trembling. She let out a startled scream and scrambled to cover herself. Robert turned, wide-eyed, adrenaline shooting through him. He fumbled for his clothes. It was all so chaotic. Her bare skin, his furious, startled expression, the crumpled sheets, the sour stench of betrayal saturating the air. "What the—" he began, but I cut him off. I roared, "You shameless jerk." My voice echoed off the walls. I lunged, throwing a punch that collided with his jaw. He staggered back, arms flailing. She screamed my name, over and over, but I didn't care. I punched him again, knuckles exploding with pain. For a moment, I thought I might seriously hurt him. The anger was so raw, so all-consuming. He tried to fight back, but I was fueled by months of pent-up rage. My fists hammered him. I heard the crack of bone. Then Anne stepped between us, crying, "Michael, stop." He coughed, blood on his lip, glaring at me with both terror and fury. "God, you're insane," he rasped. "I trusted her," I snarled. "I trusted you." That last part was a lie. I barely knew him, but it felt right to say. My vision blurred, hands itching for more violence. But she clung to me, nails digging into my arms, pleading for me to stop. He spat blood, grabbing a towel off the floor, stumbling backward. "You lunatic," he muttered, then turned to her. "I'm out of here." He grabbed his clothes, shot me a look of pure contempt, and rushed out of the room, shirt half on, face bruised and swollen. He left me alone with my wife, panting and trembling in a cheap hotel suite that stank of sweat. She just stood there, half naked, tears streaking her mascara, chest rising and falling. The straps of her bra were twisted around her arms. She was disheveled, exposed. But I felt no pity, just an ache so deep it numbed every nerve in my body. Why? I asked, voice ragged. Why him? She swallowed, tears sliding down her cheeks. Michael. I shook my head, stepping back. I don't want to hear it. You ripped us apart. You took everything we had, and threw it away. For what? She raised a trembling hand. I was lonely. We were drifting apart. You never saw me anymore. You never looked at me the way you used to. I let out a harsh laugh. You should have told me. You should have said something. Instead, you sleep with this guy behind my back. I was breathing so hard my lungs ached, tears burning in my own eyes, but I wouldn't let them fall. I bit down on the inside of my cheek. A real man doesn't cry, I kept telling myself. I clenched my fists so tight my nails cut into my palms. She broke down, sobbing, shaking her head. I'd never seen her so undone. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. I stared at her, my wife, the woman I thought I loved, and saw a stranger drenched in guilt and desire. I couldn't stand the sight. I left without another word. That was how I learned beyond any doubt she was his. The rest was pure anguish. The next few weeks, she tried to talk to me, reason with me, cry in front of me, but I shut down. She'd leave me notes on the table. I never read them, just shoved them in a drawer or tore them up. I built a wall around my pain, an iron fortress. When she tried to approach me, I walked away, letting the silence smother us both. It wasn't that I felt nothing. I felt too much. Every time I looked at her, I saw her flushed body entangled with him. Every time she touched me, I heard her moan his name. A man can't live with that and remain the same. Then I discovered something new lurking inside me, a cold, methodical desire for revenge. Not just on her, but on everyone who might have turned a blind eye. I was convinced her coworkers knew and said nothing. My in-laws certainly suspected. My own sister, did she guess? It felt like the world had betrayed me, or I'd betrayed myself by being so blind. In that bleakness, I found a disturbing clarity. I wanted them all to hurt. I wanted them to see my pain and realize the cost of their silence. One day, I cornered Robert at his office. He was talking to a colleague in a corridor. As soon as he saw me, he paled. I marched right up, ignoring the startled glances around us. He tried to raise a placating hand. Michael, we should talk this out. I cut him off. You talk to me again, I break your jaw. My voice was low, shaking with suppressed fury. You ever come near her again, I'll do worse. People were gathering in corners, murmuring. His colleague tried to step between us. Robert's face flushed, but he looked away first. Fine, he muttered. You're insane, but fine. Darn right, I said, turning on my heel. Spread the word. I stormed out, heart pounding, hating the spectacle I'd caused, but also feeling a twisted satisfaction, as if humiliating him in front of his coworkers gave me a shred of control. That same day, my wife came home, eyes red, telling me Robert had contacted her. Told her I'd threatened him. She asked me if I'd gone crazy. I didn't bother to lie. No more than you, I said icily. She pressed a shaky hand to her forehead. This has to stop, she pleaded. We can't go on like this. Then leave. I snapped. Get your things and go to him. Or are you too ashamed to live that openly? Her voice broke, tears trembling on her lashes. I don't love him. I never did. It was a mistake. I don't know what it was. She choked on her own words. I gave a humorless laugh. You sure acted like you loved him. The memory of their closeness still burned in my mind. Get out. I can't look at you. She sobbed, but I turned away, marching into the bedroom, slamming the door. I heard her crying in the hallway, heard her gather her purse, keys jingling. The front door opened and closed. Silence fell, thick and leaden. And in that moment I realized how hollow I felt. The rage was a shield, but behind it, there was only emptiness. She was gone. My wife, the woman I'd built my life around, was gone, and I'd practically thrown her out. Part of me wanted to chase after her, but I stayed. A man doesn't cry, a man endures. That's what I told myself, ignoring the raw ache that pounded in my chest. Days stretched into weeks. I became a ghost at work, barely talking to colleagues, ignoring social calls. Friends tried to invite me out for a drink, but I refused. I found a bitter comfort in my solitude, seething with resentment, replaying the hotel scene 1,000 times in my head. Each time, my hatred for them, and for myself, grew stronger. She texted me now and then, short messages that I sometimes read, but never answered. I glimpsed lines like, "We need to talk," or "I'm so sorry." I left them unread after the first few words. Once, she caught me off guard in the parking lot at the grocery store. She stepped out of her car, eyes puffy, face pale. "Michael," she said, voice trembling, "I need to see you. Please." I looked at her with a calmness that frightened even me. "Don't," I said. "You've done enough." Then I walked away, leaving her standing there with tears in her eyes. The more she cried, the less I felt. It was as though my heart had turned to stone. Or maybe it had shattered beyond repair, and I was walking on shards of it, numb to the cutting edges. Weeks later, I got a message from her mother. She asked me what was going on, told me Anne was distraught, that she was staying with a friend. I gave no details, just said we needed space. I heard the heartbreak in her mother's voice, but it meant nothing to me. If she'd known Anne was cheating and said nothing, she was complicit. That was how my twisted logic worked then. Everyone is to blame. I wanted revenge, on her, on him, on the whole world that let this happen. But I couldn't figure out how to make them feel the same agony. There was no easy justice for betrayal. Inflicting physical harm was fleeting. Humiliation was fleeting. Real revenge, I realized, was letting them drown in the wreckage of their own choices. In the end, the final act of retribution came unexpectedly. I was at home, ignoring my phone as usual. Evening settled over the windows, turning them into dark mirrors. Shadows stretched across the floor. I'd poured myself a stiff drink, something I never did before all of this. Now the burn of whiskey felt like the only warmth I had left. The phone rang, a jarring sound in the hush. I glanced over, recognized her number, let it ring. But then it rang again, persistently. Something in my gut twisted. I picked up. Her voice was frantic. "Michael, please, I'm in the car. I just need to talk. It's urgent." I exhaled slowly, pressing the phone against my ear. "I have nothing to say." "Please," she begged, voice shaking. "I'm sorry, I know I hurt you. I know you hate me. But let me come over. I can't keep living like this." Hate. The word echoed in my mind. Did I hate her, or was I just broken? "Fine," I said quietly, surprising myself. "Come, if you dare." She whispered a broken thanks and hung up. For a moment, I wondered if I'd just made a mistake. But I downed the rest of the whiskey, bracing for the confrontation. A final show of everything that had festered between us. Minutes later, I heard the roar of an engine outside. Then a frantic pounding on the door. I went to open it. There she stood in the threshold, disheveled, eyes red, hair messy from the wind, still wearing a neat blouse under a coat. She looked so desperate. I felt a flicker of something. Pity, maybe. But I crushed it. She tried to speak. Her voice cracked. "Can I come in?" I nodded, stepping aside. My tongue tasted of whiskey and regret. She walked into the living room, glancing around as if it belonged to someone else. Perhaps it did. I was no longer the man I'd been. She turned to me, tears brimming again. "Michael, please, say what you came to say." I snapped. "I'm tired of this." She swallowed, her throat constricting. "I know I destroyed us. I know I broke everything good. And I can't live with that guilt. I miss you. I miss what we had. I don't know if you'll ever forgive me." but I have to try. My body felt taut, heart pounding. Her words poured out, unstoppable. She told me how it started. A spark of flirtation that turned into comfort in the arms of someone who paid attention, who made her feel desired. She told me she didn't love him, that it was never about replacing me, but about escaping the distance that had grown between us. She said she hated herself for it. She talked for minutes, maybe hours, sobbing, voice raw. When she finally paused, I just stared. My silence must have frightened her. She stepped closer, trembling. I wrote you so many notes, letters. Tried to call. You never answered. I felt the corner of my mouth twitch into something resembling a bitter smile. I don't care about your letters. I burned them. I lied. Actually, I just shoved them away unread. But it was enough to see the devastation in her eyes. She reached out a hand. I'm sorry, she murmured. I don't expect you to take me back. But please, don't hate me. I stared at her hand, at those delicate fingers that once touched me with affection, that had touched him with equal, if not greater, passion. I jerked my gaze away, disgusted and hollow. I can't do this, I whispered. You want absolution. You won't find it here. She drew in a shaky breath. Then I'll go, she choked out. I'm sorry, Michael. She turned, pushing back tears, and headed for the door. Something in me clenched. A final wave of sorrow or anger or both. You lost the right to call me yours, I said, voice low. Don't come back. She paused, head bowed. Then she opened the door and stepped out into the dark. I stood there, chest heaving, listening to her footsteps fade. The door closed. The last echo of our life together. I stood, motionless, in the silence. Minutes passed. Then the phone rang. The same ring, relentless. I let it ring and ring. By the time I picked up, I heard nothing but faint static. I set it back down. I was about to pour another glass of whiskey, my hands still shaking, when I heard tires screech outside. The noise froze me. A crash followed, muffled but jarring like distant thunder. My heart lurched. I rushed to the window. Down the street, I saw the glow of headlights skewed at an odd angle. Flames flickered. My mind refused to connect the dots for a second. Then adrenaline shot through me. I bolted out the front door, sprinting toward the scene, cold air biting my face. There was a car, her car, smashed against a lamppost. The hood was crumpled, smoke curling from the engine block. Flames licked around the edges. She was inside, slumped over the steering wheel, hair obscuring her face. My heart hammered. I yanked at the door, cursing under my breath, but it was jammed. Anne! I shouted, raw panic flooding me. I pulled harder, metal groaning. A couple of neighbors ran over, eyes wide. Together, we managed to wrench it open. Smoke and heat poured out, stinging my eyes. I reached in, grabbing her shoulders, pulling her free. She was limp, unconscious, a trickle of blood along her temple. My breath caught in my throat. I laid her on the ground as gently as I could. Sirens wailed in the distance. She was still breathing, faint, shallow. My hands shook so badly I could barely form words. Stay with me, I rasped, voice choked. She didn't respond. Her face was so pale. I pressed shaking fingers to her wrist, felt the thin flutter of a pulse. That little thread of life, fragile as a whisper. The flames crackled behind me, and I saw shards of glass glinting under the streetlight. My mind spun. If I hadn't told her to leave, if I hadn't filled her with despair, would she have lost control of the wheel? Stay with me, I pleaded again, leaning close. Don't die. Her eyes fluttered open for a split second, cloudy with pain. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. Then she coughed, a painful, wet sound that tore at my chest. Another neighbor knelt beside us, urging me to let the paramedics do their job. But I couldn't move away. I heard her whisper something, so faint I had to lean in. Maybe she whispered Michael, or I'm sorry. I couldn't tell. Then she went limp, head rolling to the side. A woman in pajamas next to me gasped. Blue and red lights strobed across the scene. The paramedics rushed in, pushing me aside gently. They worked on her frantically, hooking her up to oxygen. I stumbled back, dazed, my face smeared with tears I hadn't realized I was shedding. They loaded her into the ambulance and sped away, siren piercing the night. I followed in my car, though I could barely drive in a straight line. My hands were white-knuckled on the wheel. At the hospital, I waited, pacing the bright corridor, each step heavy with dread. Nurses rushed by, doctors in scrubs. The smell of antiseptic stung my nose. I felt a million miles from reality, like I was watching a nightmare unfold behind glass. It wasn't long before a doctor approached, features set in a professional mask. I knew before she spoke. I saw it in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. She had significant internal injuries. We did all we could. My chest caved in. Everything around me went mute, the bustling hallway receding. I vaguely heard my own voice, dull, as I asked if I could see her. The doctor nodded and led me to a small, sterile room. She lay on a hospital bed, eyes closed, face so still. I stood there, numb, looking at the woman who had betrayed me, and who had, in the end, died with my name on her lips, or maybe it was his name. I didn't know. I'd never know. They handed me a small envelope. "She had this in her coat pocket," a nurse said softly. I stared at it, the nurse's voice a distant echo. Then I gripped it, my hand trembling. I knew it was another note, maybe the last one. She must have scribbled it in a desperate attempt to explain. Or maybe a goodbye. I wanted to rip it open right there, read every word. But a bitter wave washed over me. How many times had she tried to say sorry? How many times had I refused to hear? Could reading her words change anything now? My fingers tightened on the paper. I caught a glimpse of her delicate handwriting through the fold. Then I shoved it in my pocket. I didn't read it. I couldn't. Not yet. Maybe never, because I already knew what it said, or thought I knew. Words about regret, about love, about a second chance we'd never get. I placed a trembling hand on her cold cheek. "Anne," I whispered, voice cracking. It was the first time I'd said her name gently in weeks. The monitors were silent, except for a faint hum. No beep, no breath. She was gone. And all my rage, all my bitterness, felt hollow in the presence of that finality. I don't remember leaving the hospital. The next thing I recall is staring at the battered remains of her car, towed to some lot. The front seat blackened from a small fire. The smell of burnt rubber and gasoline still clinging to the twisted metal. My hands hovered over the warped hood. She was inside this cage of steel and flames. Now it was just me, alone in a place that once held the last seconds of her life. I closed my eyes, the echo of sirens ringing in my ears. I thought about the times we laughed, the mornings we woke up together and said we'd stay in bed just a little longer. I thought about the moment she whispered not my name, and how it led us here. My soul felt hollow. There was no satisfaction, no relief in her death, just a silence that devoured everything else. The days that followed were a blur of funeral arrangements, condolences from people who knew only half the story. My face remained stony, my words minimal. Some said I looked calm, strong even, but inside, I felt nothing. No tears left to cry, no anger left to throw. Just emptiness, a man broken by betrayal, pinned beneath the weight of guilt. Because in the end, we both destroyed each other. She ran to him, and I pushed her away. We'd made our choices, and now she was in the ground. And I was free, or so I supposed. At the funeral, I saw Robert in the distance. He stood with his hands clasped, head bowed. Maybe he came to pay respects, or to see if I'd lunge at him again. I stared at him, my chest burning. But I felt too drained to act. What was the point? She was gone. We'd both lost her. Let him live with that. When the casket lowered into the earth, I stood rigid, fists clenched at my sides. I overheard a murmur of disapproval from someone who thought I should cry or fall to my knees. But I stayed standing, face impassive, swallowing the shards of my grief. Men like me don't weep in public, they said. So I locked it all inside, letting the heartbreak fester silently. That night, I found myself alone at the house we once shared. I drifted from room to room, each corner haunted by memories, by her laughter, by the scent of her perfume. I ended up in the bedroom, next to the dresser she used. I pulled open a drawer and found pictures, snapshots of us at parties, on vacation, silly poses with her leaning into me, both of us beaming. My eyes stung, and that was when tears finally broke free. Quiet, racking sobs that scoured me from the inside out. No one saw them. No one heard. It was between me and the shadows. I don't remember how long I cried. But eventually, I wiped my face, stared at my reflection in the mirror, a man I didn't recognize. Haggard, eyes rimmed red, shoulders stooped. I realized, in that moment, that vengeance had given me nothing. My anger, my refusal to even consider forgiveness, had ended in tragedy. Whether I was to blame or not no longer mattered. She was beyond pain or redemption. And so was I, in a way. I wandered to the living room, rummaging through the desk drawers until I found the envelope the nurse had given me. Her last note. My fingers trembled as I held it. Part of me wanted to burn it unopened, to maintain my self-righteous stance. But something made me pause. I stared at it, hearing her voice in my mind. How she tried to reach me, how I wouldn't listen. How she'd whispered not my name the night everything started to unravel. At some point, I realized the note didn't matter anymore. No words could bring her back or undo what had been done. So I placed it in the fireplace with the other scraps of letters I'd torn up before, and I set them alight. The flames devoured the paper, turning it black, curling the edges into ash. I watched it burn, tears slipping down my cheeks. Maybe she asked for forgiveness in that letter. Maybe she tried to explain. I'll never know. In the flicker of firelight, I spoke to her memory, voice trembling. "I'm sorry too," I whispered. Then the words were gone, carried by smoke. The next day, I called her mother, offered stiff condolences, listened to her sob on the phone, feeling a pang of guilt that I couldn't comfort her. I called my own parents as well. I expected blame, but all I got was subdued sympathy. They told me to take care, to find some closure. The word closure felt hollow. There is no closure to a story like this. There's only the slow process of living with what remains of your life. In the following weeks, I arranged for her belongings to be packed up. I couldn't bear the sight of her clothes in the closet, the scent of her perfume lingering in the air. Friends from the office offered help, but I pushed them away. I needed to do it alone. Each item I placed in boxes felt like a small funeral. Her shirts, her shoes, the little notes scribbled in her handwriting. I found a half-empty perfume bottle on her vanity and stared at it for a long time, remembering how she used to spritz her neck before a night out with me. I buried it in a box, sealed it shut. Time dragged on. People spoke of me as a tragic figure, the husband whose wife died so suddenly. They didn't know the full story, or if they did, they whispered it behind closed doors. I felt their stares. If they pitied me, I wanted no part of it. If they blamed me, I said nothing. I simply moved through my days, numb, forcing myself to function. I answered calls from the insurance company, arranged for her funeral bills, typed emails at work as though all was normal. But late at night, I'd stand in the bathroom, hands braced on the sink, staring at my reflection. I'd remember the man I was before all this happened. The man who believed in love, who once dreamed of a stable life. And I'd realize I didn't recognize that man anymore. He was gone, replaced by someone hollow, weighed down by regrets and a quiet, endless grief. Some nights, I recalled the vow I made in the heat of betrayal, to make them all pay. And I realized how empty that vow was. I had punished her by shutting her out. I had threatened him, humiliated him. In the end, the only tangible result was that I'd lost everything. Even if I claimed some twisted victory, it was hollow. She was gone. He vanished from my life. And I was alone with the wreckage. One day, I took a drive down to the waterfront, parking where she and I used to stroll on weekends. It was overcast, the smell of salt and seaweed drifting in the wind. I stepped out, walked to the railing, and looked at the water. Gulls cried overhead. I let the breeze cut through my jacket, stirring memories. She and I had once come here in the early days of our marriage, laughing like kids as we fed the birds. I closed my eyes, gripping the railing until my knuckles turned white. She whispered not my name. That was the moment everything changed. And here I was, months later, an echo of the man I'd been. I don't know how long I stood there, letting the wind lash my face. But eventually, I found a shred of resolve. If I couldn't fix what was broken, maybe I could still live. Maybe I could learn to exist with the guilt, the sorrow. I thought about the note I burned, the final words she left behind. Maybe she forgave me in those words, or maybe she cursed me. The not knowing was its own kind of punishment, and I accepted it. I turned from the water and walked back to my car. I drove aimlessly for a while, then found myself at a small diner. The place was nearly empty, just a couple of older folks sipping coffee. I sat at the counter, asked for something hot. The waitress brought me black coffee and a slice of pie I didn't order, saying I looked like I needed sugar. I thanked her quietly, took a sip, and felt an unexpected wave of relief at the simple warmth. Outside, the gray sky pressed low, and cars hissed by on wet pavement. Inside, I felt the ache in my chest, the raw wound of what I'd lost. But I also felt a strange sense of release, like the worst had already happened. Sometimes a man must lose everything to see himself clearly. I'd always believed tears were a sign of weakness, but in the last few weeks, I'd learned tears are just another form of truth. I would never be the same, but I'd survive somehow. Leaving the diner, I realized I had no one to go home to. The bedroom was empty, the living room silent. But I also realized something else. For the first time since her death, the storm inside me had quieted. I found no pleasure in that quiet, just acceptance. It was all that was left. The sun broke through the clouds in a narrow beam, illuminating the parking lot. I squinted at the light, remembering the final line she ever spoke to me, some mixture of apology and desperation. I might carry that echo for the rest of my days. The thought was both comforting and painful. I stared at the patch of sunlight cutting across the asphalt, and I felt the corners of my mouth twitch in the ghost of a sad, bitter smile. Even the bleakest skies must break eventually. I climbed into my car, turned the key, listened to the engine rumble. My knuckles tightened on the steering wheel. Then I pulled out of the lot and drove, letting the open road guide me. There was nowhere special to go, no final destination. Just the slow, constant forward movement. My heart still pounded with an empty ache, and my thoughts lingered on everything that had happened. Her betrayal, my rage, her final breath. But the day pressed on, indifferent to my pain. The city blurred around me, neon signs flickering on as dusk approached. I paused at a red light, looked at the silhouette of the skyline, and felt a surge of conflicted emotions. I was alone, but I was alive. She was gone, and I'd never again have the chance to speak the words we both needed to say. I tasted the bitterness on my tongue, forced it down. The light turned green, and I drove on, merging with the steady flow of traffic. I kept going, mile after mile, the weight of everything pressing on my chest. But with each passing block, I remembered how she used to smile when we took drives, how she would roll down the window and let the wind tangle her hair. Then I'd remember her whispering that name in her sleep. The memory of her soft, traitorous voice. I gripped the wheel until my knuckles ached, holding my breath. Sometimes pain is the only way we remember we're still here. The day stretched into night. Eventually, I found a motel on the outskirts of town, its neon vacancy sign buzzing in the darkness. I pulled in, parked under a flickering street lamp. The air was cold and smelled like damp concrete. I checked in, paid for a room with battered bills. The manager, an older woman with a smoker's cough, handed me the key without looking up from her crossword. I made my way to the small, musty room, locked the door behind me. I stood there, letting the dim yellow light wash over stained carpet and a sagging bed. It wasn't home, but at least it was somewhere I could be alone with my thoughts. I dropped my jacket on a chair and sank onto the bed. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, but I didn't close them. Instead, I stared at the ceiling, hearing the hum of the air conditioner, the muffled drone of passing cars outside. Somewhere in the depths of my mind, I imagined her face. Not the face contorted in betrayal or the face still in the hospital bed. I pictured her smile, genuine and warm, from the days when we first fell in love. Back when I was a younger man, a kinder man, and she was everything I wanted. That memory felt like a dream from another lifetime. I sat up, my chest tight. The motel room pressed in on me. I went to the sink, splashed cold water on my face. The mirror above showed me a hollow-eyed stranger. I thought of how she'd once teased me about the tiny scar on my eyebrow, how she used to run her finger over it and call it my rugged hallmark. I touched that scar now, feeling the ridged skin, remembering her laughter. A wave of grief welled up, unstoppable. I lowered my head, hands gripping the sink, tears dripping into the basin. I made no sound, not even a sob, just silent, trembling tears, because men aren't supposed to cry. Yet there I was, leaking sorrow into the flickering fluorescent light. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, letting that final release wash over me. But when it ended, I felt emptier than ever, yet somehow lighter too. Because now there was no more fighting, no more running from the truth. I'd lost her. She'd betrayed me, and I'd let her die without granting forgiveness or even hearing her out. That was my burden to carry. But I was still breathing, and life would go on. Eventually, I turned off the light and lay on the bed, fully clothed, arms crossed over my chest. I stared at the shadows creeping along the ceiling, breathing in and out. My thoughts slowed. Somewhere, in the distance, a train horn sounded. I closed my eyes. For the first time in a long while, I felt the tendrils of sleep beckon me down, not as a torment, but as a reprieve. Before I surrendered to the darkness, I mouthed a few words into the still air, words she'd never hear, words that might have changed something if I'd only said them sooner. I'm sorry, too. Then I let the night take me, the hollow ache in my chest still pulsing with each heartbeat, but quiet now, like an old wound. The memory's still there, carved into my soul. Her whisper that wasn't my name. The pain I tried to bury. The revenge that gave me no solace. And somewhere in that silent emptiness, a faint flicker of acceptance, the fragile beginnings of tomorrow.